All right, my little seventh graders, I'm going to make one or two of these videos this week, so here we go. Today we're starting the Cold War. So what is war? Well, war doesn't have to be physical, right? War was actually explained very well in Block 2. War is something where there's differences between two people, two groups, two nations, two societies, two cultures, where they disagree with something. And sometimes they physically fight, right? But sometimes there's, different types of forms. Sometimes you can ban trade. Sometimes you can block them. Sometimes the warfare is different. So you could use chemical warfare or cold, meaning the threat of warfare. The idea that we're going to threaten to bomb you, but you don't actually. Or the idea that there's information warfare. We're going to prevent you from learning some information. Or cyber warfare. We're going to attack you computerally, which isn't a word. And then there's nuclear warfare. I think we understand what that is. So that's what we got. Now, what you're doing is you're writing an essay. We're looking at the Cold War between 1949 and 1991 between the United States and the Soviet Union and other countries affiliated with the Soviet Union. Here's the details. The essay will be no longer than 3 pages, type 12, double space, 12 font, times New Roman MLA format, third person. The essay is due Friday. By the end of the day, April 21st, Friday, the end of the day. You will have Friday in class to work on it. Your introduction will be as follows. The first sentence will state the definition of Cold War. So again, we're going to talk about that. The definition of the Cold War is the first sentence. Then you'll have 2 to 3 sentences that explain 2 or 3 events between 1949 and 1991 that make this era a Cold War. Then you'll have body paragraphs. The essay must include the things in the bottom in the following, and it should be in this order. Trust me. You'll talk about the Soviet Union first, then containment, the arms race / nuclear war, the Berlin Wall, which led to the Berlin airlift, the Korean War, the Cuban Missile Crisis in Vietnam, the Soviet Union collapses, and the end of the Cold War. Now, how many body paragraphs should we have? It's not about body paragraphs. It's about being no longer than 3 pages, type 12 font, double space, times New Roman MLA format. Third person. I would suggest making paragraphs that combine this stuff, though. So we watched a music video about the Russians talking about the atomic weapon, Oppenheimer's deadly toy, and how it could destroy the world. And so it became a armaments race, arms, meaning like building guns and bombs and stuff, between the Soviet Union and the United States. Now, again, the Soviet Union was a socialist-style government that contained nations from 1922 to 1991. Now, what they did was they created a communist society. The Soviet Union was gigantic. 11 time zones? Holy cow. It was made up of 15 countries. Armenia, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Estonia, Georgia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Latvia, Lithuania, Moldova, Russia, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Ukraine, and Uzbekistan, just to name a few. So it was gigantic, this Soviet Union. A union just basically is kind of like saying the United States of America. The union is the united part. So this is the united countries of the Soviets, Russia. So Joseph Stalin takes power during just before World War II and transforms the Soviet Union into a massive superpower. What he does is he creates everything to be, communist. The idea of getting rid of political and social enemies, people working on collective farming projects, people working on just government-funded projects, and everyone works for the government. And what happened after the war is that, Germany lost World War II, so it became divided. After World War II, Germany was divided into 4 zones. The French occupied a zone, the blue. America occupied a zone, the gold. The British occupied a zone, which is the green. And then the Soviets controlled a zone, which was the red. Each of these zones is controlled by different governments, and they all have different ways of ruling. And Berlin, the capital of Germany, was divided between the Americans and the Soviets. Spoiler alert, this doesn't become a good thing. Okay? So the Cold War was not an actual war. The Cold War was called the Cold War because of the cold relationship between the United States and all nations associated with the Soviet Union. So that's what the Cold War is. That goes in your introductory paragraph. The Cold War, it was not an actual war, but an era where there was a cold or bad relationship between the Soviet Union and Soviet countries and other countries that fall to communism versus the United States. The Cold War is going to affect the following countries: Korea, Cuba, Vietnam, Germany. All of these territories are going to be affected by the Soviet Union and America. Again, the Cold War was kind of like a World War III, but not actual fighting, threats of fighting. And it all started with different ideas or ideologies. An ideology is an idea or a belief. The United States was a democratic and capitalist society, where the Soviet Union was a communist and socialist society. The Soviets believed that capitalism divides the wealthy from the poor and creates unfair social status. Because in a communist society, everyone is treated equal, everyone has equal opportunities, the government controls everything, the government makes sure that everyone gets what they all need. It doesn't really work that way, though. Where in capitalist society, you can earn your way up or you can not earn your way up or down. So that was really what defines the Soviets from the Americans. Now, the Americans, an American guy once said that communism and Soviet power needed to be contained, that we need to prevent the spread, that we need to prevent the spread of Soviet communism, socialism, etc. And so the idea of containment is to prevent further Soviet and communist ideas from spreading throughout the rest of the world. If we can prevent communism from spreading, then we can make sure that communism is, quote unquote, contained, which would prevent more war. Because if you don't contain communism, it could create even more war. That was the idea. Now, the Cold War becomes a war of threats, not necessarily actual fighting. In 1946, the United States tested 2 more atomic bombs. They were gigantic. And the Soviet Union was angry that, first of all, they didn't even know about the atomic bomb that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki until they happened. And so the Soviets were like, during World War II, we're friends. Why didn't you tell us about this atomic bomb? Why didn't you tell us you were going to use this incredible weapon? And the Americans wanted to keep it a secret so that way it wouldn't get out, so that way the Japanese would be surprised. Now, Russia, the Soviet Union, they were not happy with this. And so then they developed their own atomic bombs, and they even threatened to use them if necessary. They tested one in a part of Russia that was 600 times more powerful than Hiroshima. Whoa, not necessary. And so that makes a cold environment. No, because Russia's not cold. But the idea is that they weren't working together. Winston Churchill, a prime minister of Great Britain, a really good prime minister or president of Great Britain, said, an iron curtain had fallen across Europe as a barrier between the Soviet-controlled nations and the free, capitalist, democratic nations. Basically, he said that these countries in the east of the Soviet Union, these countries are communist, and there's a quote-unquote iron curtain or border that separates the free parts of Europe versus the communist parts of Europe. The red controlled is communist, the blue is controlled free, and the Iron Curtain eventually becomes a real boundary when the Germans began building a wall, the Berlin Wall. In 1961, the physical Berlin Wall is constructed, and it goes from being just a division in the city of Berlin between the eastern, which is the communist, and the western, which is the not communist part of Berlin. What happens is the eastern communist Germans build this massive wall with a 100-yard zone called the Death Zone. They build over 300 towers where they're by armed military guards. They have 100 bunkers. I mean, electric fencing and concrete fencing to prevent people from East Germany going to free West Germany. Basically saying, you're a part of our union, so you're not allowed to leave. And if you want to leave, we'll shoot you. It's kind of like the 38th parallel today between North and South Korea. Magically, do you think the Soviet Union is telling the people in East Germany, the Soviet East Germany, that their lives are better? I'd like to think they're doing that too. Were their lives actually better? No. Now, President Truman of the United States said, you know what we're going to do? We're going to support free people. We're going to try to make sure that they are not conquested or taken over by outside pressures. I don't think conquested is a word. So there are these signs that would say you are now leaving the American sector of Berlin. And the graffiti, which is kind of cool, there's no way the communists would have allowed graffiti on the wall. And people in Berlin were very angry that the wall was built because it separated families from each other. And they destroyed buildings in order to build this wall. This Berlin Wall flick, it's good, it's important. I hope you watched it. Now, what President Truman wanted to do, he said, you know what? In 1947, the United States is going to help those countries that are in need. And he's saying those countries in communist countries. So Congress then said, we'll provide $400 million to help Europe, called the Marshall Plan. Congressman named Marshall came up with the idea. But the United States eventually sent $13 billion of goods from United States, from capitalist free Europe to communist Berlin from 1948 to 1952. The Americans dropped big containers that had food, water, medicine, clothing. This Marshall Plan turned into this Berlin airlift. Airlifting as in like they're dropping these supplies. On June 26, 1948, the first planes took off from bases in England where they said, we're going to start dropping this stuff. Now, it's kind of a big deal. Over 2 million citizens in Berlin were kind of afraid that these things were going to be dropped from the sky and that the government, the Eastern Soviet-style communist government, was going to punish the people. For nearly a year, though, American planes dropped over 200,000 planes, dropped more than 1.5 million tons of supplies. And you've got people over here on the side of on Eastern Europe where things have been destroyed. And the American planes are dropping goods over into Western Berlin. Heck, you know what I'm going to do? Berlin airlift. So Berlin airlift, right? Dropping these goods. So the way it was, American planes divided cities this was a common sight. If I can get the picture to be in the middle of the screen. This is a really common, dadgummit, it's a Quizlet. You know what I'm trying to show you though. All right. This was the image. People waiting for American planes to drop goods onto Western Germany. On Eastern Germany. So that way the Eastern Germans would get goods. It was that idea that we want to make sure that those who are under communist countries get goods from non-communist countries, which makes the non-communist countries look pretty good. So that is an introduction to our Cold War. All right? So that gives you a little intro to what we have in terms of the Cold War. Make sure you're taking notes on this stuff because your essay is due on Friday by the end of the period. You're going to have reading to do outside of class. Be ready. Be good.